This is a tutorial showing how I painted a Turk's cap lily using watercolor markers. So the first thing that I do is draw out the lily on watercolor paper, 300 GSM watercolor paper, nice and thick, BOCKINGFORD, St. Cuthbert's Mill. And then you can see from this first shot that I've done a little tester to make sure that my colors are going to work. So when I start applying this Scarlet Aquamarker, I know that this, and in combination with the next marker, Sangria, those two colors are going to blend together and give this shadow on one of the petals a really, really nice dark red kind of quality. So there's the Sangria going on, and like I said, I'm doing the shadow areas first. So I get a synthetic brush and I start popping on some water and mixing that water around with the pigment that's on the paper. I don't hang around when I'm using the watercolor markers. Pretty much as soon as I've used the markers and put that marker on the paper, I get the brush, I get the water, and I start working the water and the pigment together, try and blending it out, using a lot of water where I want it to go from dark to light, and using a bit less water when I want the pigment to be less diluted and much, much stronger in color on the page. I find if you leave the markers and then try and add water, they kind of stain the paper or they stick and they fix, and it's really difficult to kind of blend them together. So I tend to get that water on as soon as possible after I put the marker on. And I've decided to start with the shadow areas on this particular flower because that will then help me kind of judge and gauge how dark and how light virtually all the other colors in the picture have to be. So start with the shadows, and I'm doing most of the shadow areas first. In this particular small section, I put on the Scarlet, I put on the Sangria, I blend them together, but I feel as though there's a little bit too much pigment there. It's too dark. So instead of blotting it with a tissue, what I do is I just dry the tip of the brush on a bit of tissue that I've got next to me. I dry that out, and then I bring the brush back in and I lift off some of that color that's there, and then dry the brush again, come back in, lift off a bit of color that's there with the dry brush, and do it one more time, so a third time there, just to give it that kind of dark to light feel. So on some of these petals that should be shadowy, they're on a side that's catching the light, even though they're curved underneath there. So you can see me adding Sunburst yellow here and using Scarlet. So I'm holding off on the Sangria for this particular area, so the darker red. So I leave that out and I just use the red and the yellow and then try and blend those two together. And this is going to be a base. There's going to be more shadow going on this area later, but this is kind of like a base color. So instead of using an orange marker, I've decided to kind of limit my markers, to make it a bit easier on me. And I'm just using red and yellow here, blending the red and yellow together on the paper to get the orange that I want. And it also means that as I do the entire picture, I won't have a constantly similar shade of orange. I'll always add a little bit too much yellow or a little bit too much red to when I'm trying to make this orange, which will give it a different kind of tone throughout the entire picture. And again, here you can see me picking up a little bit of that color, that dark color, to reveal a bit and leave a little bit of the yellow color underneath. So done a couple of those kind of more colorful shadows underneath. Now I'm doing the actual petal that is facing the light, that is curving up and over. So here I'm not using Sangria at all because I want these petals to look paler and lighter than the shadowed ones. So here I'm just using Scarlet and I'm just using Sunburst yellow, and I'm going to blend those two together. And if you can see a little bit of kind of like orange on the tip of the yellow marker when I use it here, it's just because as I blend it and put it on, you can see now I'm going along the edge of the red and then working my way outwards. It just contaminates the tip a little bit. It's no biggie. You can wipe it off on a bit of paper, or you just keep working it and it'll gradually go back to yellow. But that's why the yellow has, a bit of an orange quality at times. I've just contaminated it with the red. So here you can see me mixing the colors together using the synthetic brush, and I'm using a fair bit of water here so I can blend the yellow and the red together. And then as I move into the center here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the water jar. I'm going to dip the brush in, get a nice clean blob of water on there. So then when I bring it back in and I try and blend this middle area that's really catching the light, it's going to be much more yellow. There you go, and much brighter. So I'm already trying to get that effect of dark into light as this petal sort of curves and curves up and around. As a dark to light effect that suggests depth, it looks okay at the moment. It goes from a dark red at the bottom to that kind of orange, then that sort of strip of yellow in the middle, and then back up to orange and red at the top. So it looks okay, but these are very, very shiny petals and the sun is really catching them. So what I want to do is create a stronger highlight through that kind of middle section that you can currently see is sort of a yellowy orange. So the way I decide to do that is to blot it with a bit of tissue paper. So just basic regular tissue paper, kind of wadded up. So I've got a strip of it and I press that down. You can see it lifts some of the colour up. Because it's still wet, some of that colour floods back in straight away. So I dab it 2 or 3 more times to get a slightly more bright highlight in the middle. And then I just use a bit of clean water on the brush to try and blend the edges a little bit. And I like the effect, but I just didn't think it was bright enough. So when I had to do the petals over on the other side, I pressed down harder with my bit of tissue paper and I blotted it a little bit more because I wanted a stronger, brighter white highlight. And that's what I did with all of those other petals that were really catching the light coming in from the left-hand side. So as you can see, I fill in each of these little petals. It starts to look like a kind of a curled up spider kind of effect to this plant. It's an amazing looking flower. But still, I had to do these little kind of, I think they're kind of like the stamens at the bottom. And because the flower kind of hangs over and curls up, they hang downwards, like they do in a fuchsia or some other kind of flower like that. Used exactly the same colours, just used a blend of Scarlet and Sunburst yellow, and made sure the Scarlet was at the area that was right underneath the flower where it was going to be a lot more shadowed. And I follow the same approach, whether it's one of the brighter petals or one of the shadowed petals. I use the same colours and the same approach for each one, the same process on each one. There was like a thicker kind of stamen hanging down from the very, very centre. So I used my combination of Scarlet and Sangria again to make this one darker and make it distinct from the other 3 that were hanging down. You can get an orange watercolour marker, of course you can, but looking at it, now, looking at the combinations of reds and yellows that are used and all the different kind of yellowy oranges that are actually on this flower, I don't think I would have got anywhere near that kind of range of warm tones and warm colours if I'd just been using the kind of standard orange watercolour markers to do this. So it's really taking shape at this point with lots of the petals done, and I decided to do those little polleny bits on the end of the stamen using a combination again of the Sangria and the Scarlet red, just to make sure that when I blend those 2 together, it's a nice dark red, but it's lighter on that edge that is facing the light on the left-hand side of the paper here. So with most of the basic colours now done on the entire flower, it's time to start thinking of darkening some of those shadow areas. I said earlier some of these areas are going to be base colours. So in a little ceramic mixing dish, I'm mixing Scarlet and Sangria, and now I'm using a size 3 Sable brush, so a more kind of soft watercolour brush, and I'm going to apply some shadow areas just very, very quickly, just to some of these edges. So I'm just painting over some of the lighter colour that was there. So I'm not going to be too fussy because obviously when you paint over undercolours, they can sometimes blend together if you keep working the brushwork a bit too much. But there are some kind of sharp shadows that you can see on the underside of some of these petals. And really the only way I could do that was to do the undercolour first and then put the shadow areas on top of them. Painting that undercolour and then doing the shadows in this way just allows me to get some of those shadows a sharper, crisper edge, and that provides a contrast between the ones that gradually change from dark to light. So after getting some of those shadows done, I had to do the spotted details that you get on these petals. These petals have got these amazing little brown spotted kind of pattern, which gives them a great deal of detail and visual interest. So I mixed up some Sangria and I used the size 3 Sable brush and I started just popping on little kind of discs, but I could see straight away they weren't going to be dark enough and I wasn't happy with them. So a bit like when I was using the tissue paper, I had to do a second attempt here. So I decided to add Mahogany here, so a darker brown marker in with the Sangria and mix those together, again with the nice fine point of the Sable brush, and to go in and have a second go at doing these kind of spotted pattern, spotted areas on the petals. And this was a much better brown. As you can see, it's much darker, it's got a lot more contrast, it's popping off the page. So all I had to do now was try and do those little spots, and some areas where they curved away from you, they would be thinner because they would be more like an oval, and then as they kind of curled around or directly in front of you, they were a little bit more circular. So those were the kind of differences that I had to try and show when I was doing this spotted design. I'm not really used to painting a flower that's got this kind of design, this kind of pattern on it, and it was one of the things that attracted me to wanting to paint this flower in the first place. Obviously the beautiful orange petals was one that was so warm and so attractive, but these kind of dots and this kind of pattern made it a lot more interesting to do than the kind of flowers perhaps I would normally choose. When I came to do the shadow areas, I just used the exact same blend of colour because I was using a reference photo. In the reference photo, you could see that the dots were visible within the shadow areas, but they weren't very distinct and they were kind of difficult to see. And I thought, well, that's great. Well, if I use exactly the same colour, but I'm putting that on top of dark colour, then they won't be as strong a contrast as the way that you see them at the front. So when I came to do the dots that were on the front of the petals and they were facing the light and they were going to go across the shiny bits, I was going to have to show that these kind of like dots, these patterns were lighter when I got to this section. So the way I decided to do that was exactly the same way as I actually put the highlights in the first place. I would paint the dots on, and when it was across a highlighter on one of the lighter areas, I would just get a bit of tissue paper and I would just blot that dot. So, you know, make it a slightly more ghostly, fainter kind of dot than the darker ones that I'd put on. So what I did was I just kept putting on a couple of dots, grabbing myself a bit of tissue paper and then just gently blotting them to take some of that colour off the top. And once I kind of got the right amount of pressure to apply to just take the right amount of colour off and not completely erase the dots, then it was just a case of kind of like repeating that process again and again, painting those dots on and blotting them each time to make sure that they look really pale when they fell across one of the highlights on the petal. And that would hopefully give me an extra feeling of depth overall on the whole flower. So knowing that process worked and I was happy with the way that it was going, I could just roll that out across every single petal on the flower, and that's what you end up with. You've got all the dotted pattern there, and I was just left to do the stalk on the actual flower. And this I just decided to use again a blend of the darker brown that I'd used earlier to do the dots, Mahogany, and also Sangria. So using the same colours throughout the piece of work gives the entire flower a kind of a coherent kind of feeling, because I'm not just changing to a new brown, a new blue, a new whatever colour each time. I'm kind of using combinations of the same colours across the entire flower. So hopefully that will help the whole thing hang together and not make one area look really weirdly out of place. I know some people might be watching this bit and going, wow, look at the amount of, you know, working the paper that he does with the brush, you know, brushing back and forth, back and forth. When I do that, all of the paper starts to bobble and so basically come apart. But as I said at the start of the video, I have drawn this out on 300 GSM, so really nice and thick watercolour paper. And it is this Bockingford St. Cuthbert's Mill one. And even though you can see me working the colours quite a bit with the brush, the paper is terrific. It's lovely and thick. It really holds together, and it actually works really well with the watercolour markers. So here you can see me starting a green background, but you can see me using yellow, and then I add to that a bit of a blue, a deep sapphire blue, so that I'm combining the two to make my greens. So just like I did with the flower when I didn't use orange watercolour markers, when I'm doing the green background, I'm not using a green watercolor marker. I'm using a combination of yellow and blue together to give me the kind of greens that I want. And again, this should give me, depending on how much yellow and how much blue I use in the background, kind of different tonal qualities across the whole of the background instead of it being just a flat, similar green. So I just put the two marker colours on top of each other and then blend them, and I've gone back to using the synthetic brush here, which has got a bit more spring and is a lot better for actually mixing the colours together on the paper. You notice that when I mix the colours in the palette, that's when I use the Sable, classic watercolour brush. So I just use the synthetic one when I'm mixing the marker colours together on the paper. And here I just pop in a little bit of water just so it's dark on one edge and then it's gradually changing to light towards the other. And I used exactly the same kind of process across the entire background here. And what I was trying to go for was where the petal was pale, I wanted to put some dark background color against that, and when the petal was dark or a much stronger red, I wanted to make that a much paler green in the background. I got this idea from looking at some Georgia O'Keeffe paintings, and I'm not really sure if it worked. But with the background done, it was pretty much finished. Let me know in the comments below if you found this tutorial helpful. Let me know your comments on the painting. Looking at the two side by side, the reference photo and the actual picture, it's quite clear that I didn't quite get it as bright as it was in real life, but when I was painting it, I felt like it was super, super bright. Really pleased with the dotted effect, although again, that could have been a bit darker and a bit stronger in colour. But let me know what you think below. If you want to check out some of my previous watercolor or water kind of painting videos, there are some links for those posted below, so you can click on those and check those out as well. Thanks for watching.